I don't know, you can hear me, I think, yes? Yeah. I don't know how many of you know that I have an honorary degree from this fine university, which I cherish. And when I got it, I saw in Tim O'Shea's office the famous portrait of David Hume, really my favorite philosopher, in his pink beret. And ever since then, I have coveted a pink beret. If anybody knows somewhere in Edinburgh where a pink beret can be purchased, I wish they would let me know, because I think that might be the first order of business for me tomorrow. It may well be that there's no place in town where you can get a pink beret, but if you think you know of a place, I would really like to hear about it, because that would be a great souvenir. Okay, so you see the title, De-Darwinizing Culture, and we'll get right into it. My good friend Peter Godfrey Smith, a few years ago, published a book called Darwinian Populations and Natural Selection. And in that book, he introduced a thinking tool, which I have decided is one of my favorite new thinking tools, and I'm going to introduce it to you, and you will see what kind of use I'm going to put it to in this talk. And here's the first of these. This is a Darwinian space, and it's a regular 3 space where you can plot anything you like on the 3 dimensions. And what Peter recommends is that you plot 3, what shall we say, dimensions or aspects of evolution, which can vary. And then we can see that some phenomena are very paradigmatically Darwinian, and others are only sort of Darwinian, and as we trail off on the dimensions, they become less and less Darwinian. So let's do a little bit to see how it goes here. Up here in the upper right-hand corner at 1, 1, 1, you have maxed out all 3 of the dimensions in the diagram, and that's where we put our paradigm cases of natural selection. And this is where you have high heritability, you have dependence on intrinsic fitness differences being responsible for the selection, and you have continuity of the fitness landscape. Let me just walk through this a bit. Here we see the error catastrophe. As everybody points out, if the fidelity of replication of the genome is low, then you won't have evolution, because the genome will sort of disintegrate. The noise will overcome the gains faster than the gains can accumulate. So it's very important to have high fidelity replication, but not perfect. If you have perfect replication, then you don't get mutation, and then the whole thing stalls. You've got to have some, so that all of the paradigms have to be off this wall here. This is the high H wall, and it's a limit. You want to get really close to that limit, but not right on it. This dimension here, S, is dependence on realized fitness. And you'll see down here we have drift. You can have features that by genetic drift go to fixation, as it were, for no reason at all. It's just an actuarial happenstance. It's a sampling error which overcomes a small population, and something goes to fixation in a population without cause, as it were. Over here, on the we have a rugged, ultra-rugged landscape. Evolution is often characterized as hill climbing in a fitness landscape. And if the landscape is too jagged, then it won't work. It's got to be, to a first approximation, that small steps, if you keep taking small steps in the upward direction, you'll reach a maximum, and if you're really lucky, you'll reach the global maximum. If not the global maximum, then at least a local maximum of some sort. So here are 3 dimensions: fidelity of heredity along here, dependence of realized fitness on intrinsic properties along here, and continuity, smoothness of fitness landscape along here. And now I want to draw your attention to this one right here, human cells. We're going to come back to that. Look where he puts human cells. He puts human cells low in S and high in everything else. And you'll see why in just a minute. One of my favorite books on evolution is this classic by Urs Zathmary and John Maynard Smith, The Major Transitions in Evolution. And here they are. These are the ones that are mainly concentrated on. The eukaryotic revolution, sex, multicellularity, language, human culture. I'm not going to talk about the first three tonight, but I am certainly going to talk about language and human culture, which they say, correctly, is a major turning point in evolutionary history. Evolution, this is like gear shifting. You start in a low gear, then every time you have one of these major transitions, evolution itself evolves and moves into a sort of higher gear. More things become possible, but you pay a price. And we'll be looking at the price as well. So now back to this diagram and the human cells. And one of the points that Zathmary and Maynard Smith make is that when you get a transition, say to multicellularity, we're multicelled. But our ancestors, if you go back far enough, were single-celled organisms. And single-celled organisms, eukaryotic cells, fended for themselves in the oceans for 1 billion years, roughly speaking, before they got together to form multicellular organisms, and we're descended from those multicellular organisms. Well, once you go multicellular, you don't any longer reproduce the same way you used to. The eukaryotes reproduce by splitting, by fission, just like bacteria. But now, of course, we've got sex, and we've got the distinction between the ovum and the sperm and the somatic cells, and that makes a big difference. So there's a price to pay for getting the security of being part of a multi-celled organization. So at each transition, you get important shifts in the way evolution works and what it can do. And that's going to be important in the story we're going to tell. So what Peter Godfrey Smith says is that the reproduction of human cells is a de-Darwinized process. Now let's go back. What he means by de-Darwinized is that their ancestors were paradigm cases of evolution, just like bacterial evolution, which is perfect. They met all the conditions for natural selection. They were parade cases of evolution. But by the time you get to human cells, they're not. Let's think in particular about brain cells. When a baby is born, before a baby is born, it has more neurons, more nerve cells, than it's going to use for the rest of its life. There is a pruning, there is a selection, and it's severe. And there are waves after waves, generations of selection, which prune away neurons which are not playing a good role. So it's very much a Darwinian process, but it's not perfectly Darwinian. It's a little bit un-Darwinian. On which dimension is it un-Darwinian? On dimension S. Because it's selection not for intrinsic properties. It's not that the biggest, strongest, fastest neurons win. The ones that win because of an extrinsic property. Location, location, location. It can be exactly like the ones that are next to them, but they just happen to be in the right place at the right time. They get selected for being a part of your brain, and the ones that don't quite wire up right are dissolved and recycled in the next generation. So that's a partially de-Darwinized process. It's very Darwinian. The processes of development that go on in an individual body and in the embryo are often strikingly like natural selection, evolution by natural selection. But they are unlike it in one or two dimensions, and the result is that we get this de-Darwinizing motion in the diagram. One of the particularly valuable lessons you learn from these diagrams is what Peter Godfrey Smith calls Darwinism about Darwinism. One of the things you learn from Darwin is don't be an essentialist. My favorite example of this is there is no prime mammal. If you are an essentialist and you say every mammal has a mammal for a mother, and there have only been a finite number of mammals, then you've contradicted yourself. What? Is there one mammal which was the first mammal? the prime mammal? Not really. We can't identify one because there's no essence to mammalhood which was suddenly present in one. After all, take any candidate you want for the prime mammal and realize that there's a pretty good argument against it being the prime mammal. Its mother was a therapsid. What could be a better argument for not being a mammal than that? We have to deal with gradualism, and these diagrams are great for appreciating that there are all sorts of phenomena, we'll look at some others, that are perfectly real, perfectly respectable. They're just not parade cases of Darwinian phenomena. They're slightly different in some regards that are very interesting to study in their own right. Here's another one of Peter's diagrams. And here, he's changed the dimensions. There are any number of dimensions you could put on these diagrams. What you do is consider all but 3 of them, as it were, clamped and just off stage, and look at 3 at a time to see how they interact with each other. And in this case, we have bottleneck along the bottom here. We have overall integration going up here, and we have reproductive specialization going along there. So a buffalo herd can split in 2. It can reproduce. It can have, as it were, daughter herds, and then the granddaughter herds and so forth. That's a kind of reproduction, but there's no germline, somaline distinction, and of course it's not a very well integrated thing compared with, say, up in the paradigm, us. You see that here's oak from an acorn has a strong germ soma distinction, but not as strong as us, because after all, you can make an oak tree not from an acorn. You can't plant a human finger and get a human being. But so plants are not as strong in that dimension as we are. I won't bother going over the others, much as it would be fun to do so. So now here's my first use of a Godfrey Smith Darwinian space. One of my colleagues says, just putting slime mold in the Roman Catholic Church on the same diagram makes it a wonderful diagram. I hadn't really intended to make that sort of point, but there it is. So along the x-axis, I've put growth versus reproduction. You have the Roman Catholic Church gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, whereas the Protestant sects, they divide and divide and divide and divide. They reproduce, whereas the Catholic Church just gets larger. Well, well, of course, there was that great moment back in the days of Luther when they reproduced with a vengeance. But then, since then, they've gotten larger and larger, and now they're starting to get smaller and smaller. But they're not reproducing the way they once did. An aspen grove shares that feature. An aspen grove is really one biological individual. The roots underground are all connected. They're basically clones of each other. And so the aspens spread across the hillside, but it's all really one organism. Rabbits are paradigmatic biological reproducers, but see, I'm putting cultural versus genetic along this axis. We're going to see some other diagrams. I got a virus here. I got words there. More about that in a minute. So you just see that. All right, so now, let's see, is that right? Yeah, okay. What's this? This is a food trap in fresh water. The caddis larva builds this amazing structure. Water comes in here, flows through this gourd-shaped thing, and out here. And there's a screen that the caddis erects there, sort of a net, and the food gets stuck on that, and then the caddis feeds on it. And if you look at the thing in plan, the top view, you see that it's got a passageway here so that it can get to either side of the screen without going outside. And it's a very, very cleverly engineered bit of work. Okay? There's the caddis larva. Pretty simple thing. Here's another way of getting food out of water using a sort of screen. And here's its creator. Now, what's the difference? They're similar in many ways. There are reasons for the arrangement of parts in the lobster trap. But there are also reasons for the arrangement of parts in the caddis larva's food sieve. The difference is that the caddis reasons are not represented anywhere. Not in the caddis larva's tiny little nervous system, and not anywhere else until biologists start figuring them out and writing about them. These are reasons for things being the way they are that are not the reasons of a reasoner. Because there is no intelligent designer, there's just natural selection. Natural selection has endorsed these reasons without ever representing them. This is stotting. You've probably seen this in nature documentaries, David Attenborough or somebody like that, showing you the gazelles being chased across the savannah by a lion, and they're throwing these ridiculous leaps. Why are they doing it? It looks dangerous, it looks risky, and there is a reason why they're doing it. And here is what I call the free-floating rationale. The free-floating rationales are the reasons that evolution endorses but are not represented. They're nobody's reasons. They're not anchored in any mind, in any representation of reasons. This is an idea I have to labor to get people to take seriously, that you want to get used to the idea that there are lots of reasons that aren't represented by reasoners until some clever reasoner comes along and figures them out, but that's after the fact. So here's the free-floating rationale for stotting. Don't bother chasing me. I can make these energetically expensive leaps and still outrun you. Go after my cousin who can't. Now, and the lion believes this communicative act. This is an instance of what's known as costly signaling theory. Because it's energetic, because it's costly, it's credible. And lions that don't believe it tend to go hungry. Lions that believe it tend to get fed because they don't waste their time and energy on the ones that are too hard to catch. There are a lot of examples of this, well studied. The evidence in this case is pretty strong. Careful longitudinal studies show that the gazelles that can stot do stot, and the ones that can't get eaten. And the ones that can don't, as a general rule. Here's the point, though. Neither the lion nor the gazelle needs to understand this communicative act. The gazelle doesn't have to think, hey, if I could throw in this fancy leap, maybe I could persuade this lion. No. If we want to put a thought in the gazelle's head, just think, I don't know why I want to do these jumps, but it just feels right. Yeah? And meanwhile, the lion isn't reasoning, this is a powerful critter here. Maybe I ought to go after one that looks a little lame. Or something. No, it doesn't have to think that thought. It just, for reasons it doesn't need to know, is not attracted to the ones doing those ridiculous leaps. And everybody benefits. It's a stable system. It wouldn't be stable if the leaps weren't expensive, or if the lion couldn't pick up on it. So here we have again a free-floating rationale which is not represented in the head of either the gazelle or the lion, and this is nature's way. Don't burden the brains of organisms with reasons that they don't need to understand. They don't need to know these. They can be the beneficiaries of these arrangements without having to understand them. Just the way a butterfly can be the beneficiary of having eye spots on its wings that scare away the birds because it looks like a predator. The butterfly doesn't have to understand. That's just the beneficiary. And this particular case of the gazelle is nice because it's meaning communication without comprehension. I'll tell you one reason why that's really important, that there is such a phenomenon. If there weren't, we couldn't explain what goes on in our brains. Because we got lots of neurons and neural assemblies that are communicating. They don't understand what they're communicating. They don't have to. And yet still they can communicate and they can respond appropriately to that communication without having to understand the way we understand, the way I hope you are understanding me right now. My bumper sticker for this is competence without comprehension. I haven't made it into a bumper sticker yet, but maybe I will. Because this is the great message that we get from Darwin and from Turing. And it is a strange inversion of reasoning. We'll get to that. On the left, we see a termite castle. This is Australian termites. On the right, we see Gaudi's famous church in Barcelona, La Sagrada Familia. They look very similar. They're both artifacts made by living organisms. They are, however, profoundly dissimilar in the design and construction. The termite castle, there's no architect, there's no boss, there's no planning ahead. It's just bottom-up activity by hundreds of thousands or even millions of pretty clueless little termites just doing their thing. They don't understand, they don't have to understand. And up, rising up from the ground is this amazing castle. Gaudi, on the other hand, is the very epitome, in fact, the sort of caricature of the charismatic, megalomaniac, genius creator with manifestos and blueprints and heirs, and he lords it over his second in commands, who lord it over their third in commands, who lord it over the working people. This is top-down design and construction with a vengeance. So we have on the left, bottom-up, Darwinian type design, and on the right, top-down, intelligent design. So there are the termites, pretty clueless. There's Gaudi, pretty intelligent and very much in charge. This is top-down control. Now, there's a reason why the termites do what they do, but those aren't the termites' reasons. The termite doesn't have a reason. There are reasons, but the termite isn't smart enough to have those reasons. Whereas Gaudi has reasons. Some of them he may have false consciousness of, but he's got reasons. He's a reasoner. Now, the termite can have millions of clueless, the termite colony can have millions. I looked this up. I got one estimate of 70 million in one particular termite colony. That's a lot. And of course, a brain can have billions of clueless neurons, 200 billion. Now, we know that evolution can arrange for millions of termites to get organized to do great things. Termite colonies don't just build amazing structures, but they forage very intelligently. They are, as a group, clever enough so that a book was written about them by a naturalist back in the 19th century called The Soul of the White Ant. White ant being another word for termite. The idea that a termite colony had a soul. But that doesn't. So now the question is, how do brains organize billions of neurons to do what we can do? Termite colonies are pretty darn smart, but not as smart as we are. And yet we're made of clueless neurons that don't understand a thing. How does that happen? Here's some neurons in action in a Petri dish, but neurons are always sort of trying to make connections, groping around. They have agendas of their own. No two are alike. And they're groping around, not so unlike termites. So it's a real puzzle. What lies in between the clueless termites and such intelligent designers as Gaudi? How can you make a Gaudi-type mind out of a termite colony-type brain? That's a real puzzle. Or to put it a little bit more graphically, is an ape more like a termite colony or Gaudi? And I'm sure you want to say, oh, much more like Gaudi. Apes are really clever. Well, don't be so sure. This is my favorite diagram of the great tree of life. It's by Len Eisenberg. And if you like it, I hope you do, you can get it, you can get t-shirts and bumper stickers and big posters. Let me just show you how it works. This is a nice thinking tool too. This is the present here. This is when the earth was first created. This is the origin of life. So if we go out this way, we're going through time, and you get a very vivid picture of how life evolved on this planet. First came the bacteria and the archaea, and he's drawn it so that bacteria came before archaea, but as the name suggests, there's some controversy about that. Some think the archaea came first. We don't need to settle that. But they had about a billion years of single-celled action until this great event happened, right there, the great eukaryotic revolution, the explosion, when two different prokaryotes came together, formed an endosymbiotic union, and became a much more powerful thing, a eukaryotic cell. And look at everything that happened, all the rest of the life forms. Every life form you can see with the naked eye to a first approximation is a eukaryotic, is a multicellular eukaryote. We're eukaryotes. So are trees and fish and sponges and worms. Just about anything you can see is a eukaryote. So that was a tremendous, if you want to know where we are, that little fork right there, it's about 6 million years, which is about the length of time since we shared an ancestor with a chimpanzee. So we could say this is the hominid lineage right there. Give you a sense of scale for how it goes. So there's the great tree of life. Oh, and there, in case you're interested, that's the Cambrian explosion, this sudden proliferation of different types. Famous. But I want to talk about the McCready explosion. Some of you probably heard this from me before. If so, keep your lips zipped until we've... Paul McCready, the late great green engineer. How many of you know about the Gossamer Albatross? The bicycle-powered, the human-powered plane that flew across the English Channel? He made it. He's a visionary engineer. And he calculated that 10,000 years ago, at the dawn of human agriculture, the human population, plus the livestock they'd begun accumulating, their pets, domesticated animals, accounted for less than 1%, maybe as low as 0.1% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass, that is the animals. We're not counting the insects, we're not counting the fish in the sea, we're counting the terrestrial vertebrate biomass, that's the animals. And at that time, we and our pets and livestock were a fraction of 1%, that's 10,000 years ago, which you can't even represent on that tree of life, it's so recent. It's grown since then. What do you suppose it's grown to today? Anybody hazard a guess? Who's got a guess? Yes? 70%. 70%. Whoa. Do I hear any advance on 70? No? Well, you're short. It's 98. It is 98%. The human species and its livestock has engulfed the planet. This is one of the most remarkable and sudden biological changes since life started on the planet. And it's all happened in 10,000 years. It's simply amazing. And here is what McCready has to say about it. Over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power, we now wield the paintbrush. In 10,000 years. How did it happen? Well, here's what Freeman Dyson says. Technology is a gift from God. After the gift of life, it is perhaps the greatest of God's gifts. It is the mother of civilizations, of arts, and of sciences. Well, I don't agree with Freeman about where it came from. I went back to check to see if he really said that. He really did say that. You know? Techne, or technology, it's not a gift from God. But then how did it arise? It arose by evolution, of course, but it arose by cultural evolution. In only one species, us, because we're the only ones that have culture, really. So now we've got the question of, so how did cultural evolution get started? And how was it able to do so much work that in a few 100,000 years, or maybe 1 million years, it produces a species that can overwhelm the planet the way we have done with all our technology? It is time to go back to these diagrams, because this is the one that I really want to talk about. This is the De-Darwinizing of culture diagram. And let's look at the dimensions that I put on here. Here we have bottom up versus top down. So there we have the termite castle down in the lower left-hand corner. And just an inversion of Peter Godfrey Smith's diagrams, I'm putting the Darwinian down in the lower left-hand corner. And look what I'm putting up in the right-hand corner, intelligent design. Not capital ID, but small ID. The sort of intelligent design that people in this room do. We're the intelligent designers, not God. And it's amazing that we're here. And the question is, how do we get from the termite castle to Gaudi? By process of evolution by natural selection, but not genetic. We're talking here all about cultural evolution. So look at the 3 axes that I put here. Here's comprehension, and here's competence without comprehension, and here's comprehension up on the top. Here's random versus directed search. Natural selection of genes is not directed search. It's basically random search, but we're famous for doing more directed, we use our information, our knowledge, to narrow down the search space in all sorts of ways. Bottom up versus top down. Gaudi up here, termites down there. So now the question is, what sort of processes take us through here to here? And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. You may have noticed that Picasso was up in the upper right-hand corner. Why did I put him there? Not because I think he's the most intelligent designer ever, but because he said he was. He once infamously or famously said, "Je ne cherche pas, je trouve." What a boast. What a preposterous boast. I don't have to engage in grubby trial and error. I just leap, like the genius I am, to the highest maximum peak in design space every time. I understand everything. I even understand my own understanding. Baloney. I'd say it in French, but that would be very rude. This is an ideal of creative intelligence that Picasso could not meet. I mean, it's just a lie anyway. He made lots and lots of preparatory sketches. His genius lay in signing and selling the sketches, not just the finished work. Now, but he deserves his place in the pinnacle. This is sort of the imaginary ideal creative genius, is the one who searches not, just finds. So now we want to look at how this space of culture gets filled, and it's going to be by non-genetic information transmission, not through the genes. Genes are there, they play an important role, and yes, some people have, they're gifted with an ear for music, or they're gifted with a mathematical sense, and there's a genetic component, and also genes there's been a genetic response to cultural evolution, in fact, lots of them. but we want to look at the particular roles of culture evolution itself. This is a slide I love from my friend Matt Ridley, which is it's like the termite Gaudi slide. On the left we have an Acheulean hand axe. Our ancestors made those for about 1 million years without changing them at all. The mouse has only been around for a few decades and is on the way out. The tempo has picked up. They're both human artifacts. One of them comes from the earliest days of culture. One of them, not genetic. There's no instinct to make Acheulean hand axes. One of them is high tech, and we want to understand how you get from one to the other. So how did it arise? We know some of the details. I and other people are working on the more details. First of all, there's the genetic highway, which we all know, that's the DNA, and that has been optimized over several billion years to be very high fidelity, and it's got lots of bells and whistles. It's got proofreading enzymes and all sorts of ways of making this an efficient way of getting information into the next generation. But there's also a second information highway. This is the so-called dual pathway hypothesis of, say, Boyd and Richardson, and that second pathway is social learning. Social learning or perceptual learning from your adults, from your parents, typically. It used to be thought that many instinctual animal behaviors were passed on through the genome, and now, in many instances, it's been discovered, no, the offspring learn from their parents, whether it's bird song. Some birds are born knowing how to sing their song. Other species, they have to learn it from their parents. And the same goes for food preferences, mating preferences, foraging behaviors. There's lots and lots of so-called instincts, which aren't instincts at all. They are behaviors that are passed on non-genetically through the generations. So it's not just we that have this kind of learning. This highway has been evolving and being improved and optimized, made more efficient since before the dawn of the mammals. And the regularities of this highway are themselves subject to natural selection. That is, the second highway is not just the environment, there are adaptations which enhance the highway. I'm going to talk about a few of them. Prolonged infancy. If you never meet your parents because they lay the eggs and go and maybe die before you're even born, then you're not going to learn anything from them. Almost nothing. But if you have a prolonged infancy, if you're dependent, if you are, as they say, altricial rather than precocial, then you have a long period in which the parents can, one way or another, impart information to you. And that gets utilized. That's part of the channel. We know about how many species the young imprint on parents, on the first moving thing they see when they come out of the egg. Thus we have Conrad Lorenz and Tinberg being followed around by ducks and ducklings and goslings that have imprinted on them. So very potent. Now that part, the imprinting is genetic, but what you get from the imprinting, whatever you learn as a result of following mother around, or what you take to be mother, that's not genetic. So here's a chimpanzee mother and child. Here's Homo sapiens on the right, same chimpanzee on the left. What's the striking difference between them? Whites of the eyes. Chimpanzees do not have white sclera. White sclera, arguably, are an adaptation to make it easier for human beings, little human beings, to see where mother is looking, to do what's called gaze monitoring. Gaze monitoring is very important because it permits shared attention. And shared attention is what's important for learning from mom or dad. Chimpanzees do have a little culture. The chimpanzee young will learn how to fish for ants with pieces of straw, or to break nuts with hammerstones. But the mothers have never been observed teaching them. The mothers go about their business and the kids sometimes look, but the mothers never slow down, go out of their way to attract the attention of the young, say, watch what I'm doing. There's none of this instruction, has never been observed in chimpanzees, but of course it's rife in Homo sapiens. That too. These are adaptations which are built into the genome. So you get this second information highway from parents to offspring. Once it's in place, it can be invaded. The parent-offspring channel is usually high fidelity and good for you. It's benign information because parents and their offspring sort of share a common genetic goal. They have the same interests at heart most of the time. Ask a new mother whether she and her infant always share interests. The answer is no. But by and large, they have common interests. Boyd and Richardson call the result of this invasion, they call this oblique transmission. This is where you learn something not from mom and dad, but from the person down the street or your pals at school or some other person who is not your ancestor, not your direct genetic ancestor. And this is where what they call rogue cultural variants can become interlopers, invaders on the highway. Gee, can you think of another recently developed information highway which has rogue cultural variants that have become parasitic on it? Yeah, the internet. Designed and paid for by the government, actually. It was ARPANET in the old days for military research. And now, of course, a tiny, tiny fraction of the traffic on it is military research, and we don't want to talk about what most of it is. What Boyd and Richardson call rogue cultural variants are what Dawkins calls memes. And I'm going to talk about memes and defend memes because what I have discovered that a lot of people, for I think largely bad reasons, have decided that the meme concept is hopeless, it's no good, it doesn't have any place in serious scientific or philosophical thinking about human minds, and I think that's wrong. And so part of my effort today is to rehabilitate memes in any of you who are dubious about memes. So I'm going to look at a few of the main objections to them. Main claim I want to make is that memes take advantage of the information highways built by evolution for many species, not just for us, but for chimpanzees, but it's been enhanced in us, and this creates, as Dawkins said, a new medium of evolution, a cultural medium. Memes are cultural items that evolve by natural selection, by Darwinian natural selection, but they're not living things. They're memes. They're cultural things. They don't have genes. These are not genes. These are memes. And the two objections that I encounter most often is a lot of people say, I don't even know if memes exist. I think they're just figments of Dawkins' imagination. I've never seen a meme. What are memes anyway? And what are they made of? How can there be such things? I'm going to answer both of these objections now. And not just by saying them in a funny voice. That's not an answer. Okay, now, here's a slide. Raise hands if you agree. We have one person down here who thinks that words don't exist. You read what's up there. And you were able to tell what it was you were disagreeing with. But you still doubt that words exist. Okay. But the rest of us think that words exist.
No, I agree.
Oh, well, it's not, all right, it's not unanimous. Science doesn't have to be unanimous. We have a few principal doubters, and philosophers in particular might well be doubters, because philosophers are very, very, very particular about what they have in their ontology, and so they might not want words in their ontology. They wouldn't be nominalists, because nominalists think that the only thing that exists is words. So they're sort of unnominalists or something like that. But all right, so some of you have your doubts, and well, you should, because words are a curious sort of thing, but most of us countenance words in our ontology. Now, that answers the first question, do memes exist? Why? Because words are memes. Dogs are a kind of what? Pet, mammal. You can be of several different kinds. Words are a kind of what? Think about it. Sounds, signs, symbols. Maybe words are of a kind that there is no super kind of. They're not a species of any genus. I submit that what they are is a kind of meme. More particularly, words are memes that can be pronounced. That's what distinguishes words from other memes. Words make excellent memes because they really do fit Dawkins' conditions wonderfully. They have clear genealogies. We can trace them back through history. They have an evolutionary history. They have clear histories of adoption and transmission. We can trace the invasion of words in the individual minds of individual people, and then we can watch them leave and propagate out into other individuals just like viruses. I think Richard Dawkins made a big mistake not to draw attention to the fact that among the memes he was talking about are words. I think I know why he didn't. I haven't asked him this, but I should. Darwin had already talked about words as being very much having evolutionary history. In The Descent of Man, he already has some very insightful talk about the evolution of words and languages. So that, in a way, it wasn't quite as newsworthy. It would be more obviously going piggyback on Darwin to talk about words as memes. At any rate, I think that was a tactical error on his part, because words are very good examples of memes. They have pretty good identity conditions. That's another question that a lot of people ask about the identity conditions of memes. I want to tell you the identity conditions for genes are just as embattled. So if you believe in genes, memes are in not really worse shape, or words are not in any worse shape. So we're talking now about the cultural evolution of words. Tecumseh Fitch, in an article in Nature in 2007, they did a special section on evolution of language, says that languages are neither natural nor artifacts made intentionally by individual humans. Well, they're not artifacts made intentionally by individual humans, but they're natural. They're as natural as viruses, which are certainly natural. Dawkins drew attention to the similarity, the parallel between viruses and words, and for a very good reason. Viruses are not alive. They don't have metabolisms. They're just big macromolecules. But evolution certainly, they're strings of nucleic acid with attitude. What does that mean? It means that because of their shape, they are breathtakingly adept at getting themselves into cells and usurping the copy machinery of those cells and making more copies of themselves. They travel light. They don't have their own copy machinery with them. They infiltrate into cells that do have copy machinery and trick those cells into making copies of them. That's how viruses reproduce. They're A, they're not alive, and B, they are absolutely classic cases of natural selection. So you don't have to be alive to be an object of natural selection. It's not a requirement for evolution. How about being a material thing? Is that a requirement for evolution? Dawkins says no, and I agree. Viruses depend on living cells to reproduce. Memes depend on living brains to reproduce. What are memes made of? Well, what are words made of? Ink? Sound? We haven't quite learned how to talk about it yet, but they are informational things. This is not dualism. It's not dualism because there are lots of things that are made of information. Habits. Everybody who talks about cultural evolution talks about the transmission of habits. What are they? What are they made of? They are the transmission of a certain, something like an instruction to do such and such under conditions such and such, which then gets lodged in an individual and becomes a habit. So habits can be transmitted, they can be infectious, even though they have no particles, they're not made of anything. Words, another example. Poems, songs, jokes, Sudoku, crossword puzzles, chess, techniques. Here are a few techniques: dead reckoning, surveying, long division, Bayesian statistics, analysis of variance, PCR, polymerase chain reaction. What are these made of? They're made of techniques, behaviors, habits, dispositions. They don't weigh anything. This isn't dualism. And then, of course, there's software. And the important thing about software is it's real. Actually, you know, some of you don't think words are real. Peter Godfrey Smith and I have had a debate in recent years. He's not sure software is real. And I said, what, you mean Bill Gates is a fraud? What's he been selling all these years? Seems pretty real to me. Software is informational. It's the only one on the list that's, as it were, made of bits. It's very important. When I talk about information here, I'm not talking about Shannon information. I'm not talking about bit strings. When habits are transmitted, there's no code. There is no code. Information doesn't always have a code. It's a very important point. So here we are back at our diagram, and we're going to start populating it. Now, we're going to see what goes in here. That's where the chip nut cracking and ant fishing goes. It's probably originally devised without much comprehension and somewhat pruned and improved over trial and error in some time. So there's when the youngsters pick it up, they pick it up not very directly with very intense focused instruction, so there's trial and error going on there too, but it's not random trial and error. They get focus from watching mom or dad do that work. So it belongs somewhere in that middle ground. Whoa. What happened? Oh, I went to this. There we go. Why am I going in the wrong direction? Oh, there we are. Then we get synanthropic words. Synanthropic species are species like mice and rats, bedbugs, pigeons, barn swallows. They have evolved by natural selection to do very well in our company with anthropos, synanthropos. But they're not domesticated. We don't own them. They just have evolved by natural selection to thrive in our company, as it were. And I'm going to say the first words were like that. They were wild. They were synanthropic. And the people that used them didn't know what they were doing and didn't own them, and they were just hanging around. Then we got domesticated words. And the process of domestication itself goes through first an unconscious selection process that Darwin described very well, and then you get conscious selection, which is like animal breeding, which he discusses, of course, at length. And we get that happening with words, too. We get all of our language mavens and people that are grammar scolds and so forth, and that's when language really gets domesticated. Then you get coined words. Now you see they're getting more and more like intelligent design. We have, well, like the word meme is a good example of a coined word. It has an author. It has an intelligent designer. Most attempts to design, to coin words fall flat, of course, because this is still an evolutionary process. And go ahead and create it however intelligently you can. Whether it takes off is not up to you. And then we even get technical terms. By the way, there's a good book out by Daniel Cloud, a philosopher at Princeton, called The Domestication of Language, who developed some of these points. And up at the top we have internet memes. And I have to talk about internet memes because you all know about them, and for many people it seems to be a reductio ad absurdum of the whole idea of memes. Because after all, an intelligently designed meme is a contradiction in terms. We have these contests to see who can design intelligently the most viral meme. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Yeah, so what? Really? How can I say so what? A splittable atom is also a contradiction. The term means unsplittable. But of course, in the fullness of time, we learned that atoms are splittable. Nobody objects to this anymore. In fact, this claim of a contradiction in terms reminds me of an earlier contradiction of terms, and that was Darwin's, which reminds me of the outraged passage that I love to quote and will quote yet again today, if this thing will work. And now, oh, there we go. One of Darwin's critics. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer. So we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it's not requisite to know how to make it. This proposition will be found, on careful examination, to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who by a strange inversion of reasoning seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. Exactly. That's just what Darwin did, and it is a strange inversion of reasoning. A lot of people still have trouble with it. And what I'm pointing out now is that now we've reinverted Darwin's inversion. We're back to intelligent design via cultural evolution. We have the bubble-up theory of design. The designer doesn't need to understand, the organism doesn't need to understand. When we reverse engineer the results, we discover brilliant design. Just what Mackenzie says, which has rationales, which it does, free-floating rationales. How can this be? This is a contradiction. This is design without a designer. Isn't that a contradiction? It's only apparent design, some people say. In fact, I'm having arguments with some evolutionary theorists who insist that they don't want to call what nature does design because they think that gives aid and comfort to the intelligent design crowd. I think they're making a big mistake. They just, of course it's design, it's just design without a designer. And atoms are splittable. If we can teach people that atoms have parts, we can teach people that there's design without a designer, that's what Darwin showed. Richard Dawkins, however, with whom I agree on so many things, hasn't yet tumbled to this. He still thinks that we ought to talk about designoid as the term for biological entities. Seems like design, but it isn't really design. And I beg to differ. Because I think if you're going to talk about apparent design, you want to talk about not evolved design, but stuff that just looks like it's designed. Apparent design just looks like design, and call it designoid. Here's an example. You know, no engineering went into that. That's just, it looks cool. But the parts don't work. Or here's another one. Whatever happened to elegant solutions? And the stuff on the blackboard is just gibberish. But it's very impressive gibberish. This is designoid. If we use designoid for this kind of apparent design, then we can recognize that what evolution does, what natural selection does, is real design that really does stuff. And it does it excellently. You never want to forget what Francis Crick once called Orgel's second rule, teasing his colleague, Leslie Orgel. Evolution is cleverer than you are. This has been proven so many times. Evolutionary biologists see something, they think, well, this is a dumb arrangement. Later, they come around, they realize it's not dumb at all. It's twice as clever as they ever thought. It happens again and again. So, right, memes were introduced by Dawkins as Darwinian evolvers. But we want to be Darwinian about Darwinism. Memes began as bottom-up symbiont invaders of clueless human hosts. They began down there in the termite corner. But they've become, after domestication, intelligently designed inhabitants of minds. And we'll still call them memes because they still have to be transmitted and they still have to secure their place in heads, and they have to replicate to stay going. So memes are thinking tools. Let's see, how long can I run? When did I start? Well, I got a few. With your patience, I will continue for a couple of minutes. I'll speed up a little bit. Memes are thinking tools for examining your own thought processes. There's many techniques. Think of something like being taught, count to 10 before you answer a question like that. Think how valuable that is. Think what a nice adaptation that is. It's not passed on genetically, it's passed on culturally. It's just one of those little habits that you might want to inculcate. Memes are like Java applets. Designers can be ignorant of the hardware thanks to the Java virtual machine. How many of you know what Java is? If you've got a cell phone or a laptop that goes on the internet, then you're running Java applets a lot. And the only reason they run is because there's this thing called the JVM, which is deftly installed on your hardware, which means that people can design software in Java and they don't have to worry whether you've got a Mac or a PC or a Linux machine, or it'll run on anything. That's the beauty of it. Because you've got the JVM, which you never see, you don't even think about it. Well, you all have the EVM, the English virtual machine. So I can download apps to you. That's what I've been doing. You just sit there listening and I talk, and I'm downloading apps into your necktop. And they have to compete for rehearsal time in your brain. They're memes. And some of them will win and some of them will lose. Like any software, they add a host of new dispositions to the functional architecture of your brain. I'm going to give you a dead simple example of the EVM in action. Are you ready? I want you, as fast as you can, to name the color of the words on the next two slides. Ready? Call it out. The EVM shows its face. Now, if you had the GVM, you'd have had trouble with the first slide. Anybody with the GVM in this room? Way in the back. You had trouble with the first slide. Yeah. You see, we have these virtual machines piled up between our ears, and that's where human smarts comes from. It's the apps running on the hardware, running on the wetware, running on the neurons that give human beings their tremendous power. I won't have time to go through this. In one of Doug Hofstadter's book, he just has a nice list of his tools. These are just terms. They're memes. How many of these do you have in your kit? Each one of those is a little thinking tool. It cuts to the chase. It helps you characterize things. It gives you questions to ask about things. You can say, oh, is this a case of sour grapes? Or, oh, that loose cannon, and so forth. These are And like any app, you can overuse it. You can become addicted to it and use it when it's no longer helping you, but there they are. They pile up in your head, and they compete for your attention because your attention is getting them rehearsed. Because every time you think of them, say them to yourself or say them to somebody else, that's a new generation. That's replication. You're making another one. Some of you may know about the Surely alarm. This is one of the tools in my book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. What I tell my students is, you should get in the habit of every time you see the word surely in the course of an argument, a little bell should ring. Because this is very likely to be the weakest point in the argument. For a very good reason. It doesn't quite go without saying, because if it did, the author wouldn't have said it. But the author doesn't want to stop and argue for it and show why it has to be right. So the author just sort of nudge, nudge, surely. Surely. So let's practice. Are you ready? Memes aren't alive. Surely you can't have natural selection without a living thing. I didn't hear any dings. Let me try it again. Memes aren't alive. Surely you can't. That's me. So what I've done is just downloaded an app to your necktie. And when I was doing book talks for the Intuition Pumps, I used that wherever I went. I did the Surely alarm. And then I started getting email from people saying, "How to turn off the Surely The Surely alarm has taken up residence in those heads and has had many descendants. Because each time you use it, that's another generation. And that may mutate a little bit. That's the nature of these apps that you put between your ears. They're made of information, but they're not digital. They're not bit strings. Okay. So here we are in the age of intelligent design. Cultural evolution has become ever more top-down, ever more comprehending and self-comprehending, ever more refined in its search methods. And so has genetic evolution, as you may have noticed. We have genetically modified food, Craig Venter and all of that research, so that we seem to be in the age of intelligent design. But I'm going to end on this note. I think we are about to step out of the age of intelligent design into the age of post-intelligent design, because in many fields, intelligent designers are exploiting the truth of Orgel's second rule, that evolution is cleverer than you are. I'm just going to give you a few examples. There's genetic algorithms, that some of you know about. There's deep learning, which is a profoundly quasi-Darwinian series of processes. There's evolutionary architecture and evolutionary nanotechnology. I'm going to close with two examples of that I particularly admire. One of them is John Sullivan's evolutionary architecture. This is the sort of roof of over the atrium of the Ottawa House of Commons, which was evolved to be energy efficient as well as beautiful. And he describes the process in some papers. He uses CAD systems and evolution, and then tests out its evolution. It's evolution in silicon, and he gets beautiful results. Here is Frances Arnold of Caltech winning the inaugural Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering just a couple of years ago. What does she do? She evolves proteins that have never existed before in the history of life on the planet. This is evolution in the engineering lab. And she told me once that some of her senior colleagues said, "Well, Frances, these proteins you're trying to make, nothing in nature has the powers that you're trying to put in these." She says, "That's right, there's never been selection for it before. The space of possible proteins is vast, and only a tiny corner of the space of possible proteins has been looked at because evolution has simply not got around testing, selecting for the others. And so she's giving evolution. This is directed evolution, but it is evolution. Just a couple of quotes I like from some of her recent papers. Consequently, these enzymes may open up whole new regions of chemical space that could not be explored in previous medical chemistry efforts. We're developing new tools for protein engineering and using them to create new and improved catalysts for carbon fixation, sugar release from renewable polymers such as cellulose, biosynthesis of fuels and chemicals. Imagine if we could take the world's cellulose, the world's paper trash, and turn it into fuel. She's going to try to make proteins that can do just that. Thanks for your attention.